Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here today to tell you about my top 10 novels of 2022. So these are the best of the best. I read a lot of good fiction last year, so this was a tough decision, but I've picked out what I think are my top 10 favorites. First, if you watch my channel, you've probably heard me talk about this book a lot. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir was my #1 favorite. These first few are kind of in order. Andy Weir is the famous author of The Martian, but this book is, The Martian was great, but this book just has so much more depth to it. It's got the science and the suspense and the humor that The Martian had, but this book also has a lot of heart. It's very warm, it's very moving. I just loved every minute of this book. My husband read it and he felt the same way about it. While I was reading it, I kept like gasping out loud or laughing or saying things, and he'd put his own book down and say, "Which part are you at? Tell me." Because it's just so good, and it's the kind of book you want to share with someone. So highly recommend Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Until I read Project Hail Mary, this was my #1 book of the year, This Tenderland by William Kent Kruger. So definitely in the #2 spot. I had never read Kruger before. Since I read this, my husband's really gotten into him. He hasn't read this one yet, but I've been buying him the Cork O'Connor books, the series that Kruger writes, the mystery series that Kruger writes, and he's really loving those. This Tenderland is set during the Depression in the 1930s. It's about 4 orphaned children who escape an abusive situation by taking a canoe down the river. Their plan is to follow the rivers until they get to the Mississippi and then all the way down to St. Louis. They're starting out in Minnesota. So this book just has everything. It's suspenseful. It's about friendship and family. It's a travelogue. It's wonderful historical fiction about what was going on at that time. And the kids stop at various places along the shore and, their different experiences. It's a wonderful book. It was the all-county reads book for my library system, and we got free copies for my book group. So the whole book group read it. It was one of our best books read last year, and one of my favorites for sure. Next on my list is Kindred by Octavia Butler. I've been meaning to read an Octavia Butler novel for years, and I finally got to it because my local bookstore, my local independent bookstore, chose Kindred for its February read. And I haven't been to one of their book groups in a long time. They were doing this one on Zoom, so I am so glad I took part in it because this book blew me away. First, it's about time travel, which I love, but it's also just so beautifully written, so powerful. It's about a modern-day Black woman. The book actually takes place in the 1970s. Somewhat modern-day Black woman who travels back in time to a Maryland plantation where her own ancestors lived in 1815, I believe. So you can just imagine the kind of experiences that she has. Her time travel is not something she can control. She just goes back when she's needed there and returns to modern times without her control. So it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And now my husband and I watched season 1 of the Kindred TV series on Hulu, which is excellent. They did change a few details from the book, but I think it works. My only problem with it so far is that they did break it into separate seasons, without being approved yet for a second season. So we loved the first season. It ends on a cliffhanger, and we're just crossing our fingers and hoping that it comes back for another season. But definitely recommend the book, Kindred by Octavia Butler. Lucky Turtle was another novel in my top 10 last year. Lucky Turtle by Bill Rohrbach. This was a Booktopia choice. Booktopia is an annual event I go to in Vermont every May. It's the first weekend of every May. They just announced it for this year. If you're interested in it, check my videos. I've got one about last year's Booktopia. So it's usually new releases. The authors come. It's sort of a very casual event where authors and readers get to hang out together all weekend, which is so fun. Bill Rohrbach is not a new author. He's written a lot of novels, won a lot of awards. I had never read anything by him. This one I actually read this summer during Big Book Summer. It came out during Booktopia, so I didn't have a chance to read it ahead of time. Though I did buy my copy at Northshire Bookstore where Booktopia is held, and Bill signed it for me. Lucky Turtle is a wonderful novel. I really enjoyed it. It's essentially a love story, but it's about romantic love, but it's also about friendship. It's about the love between a parent and a child. It covers decades of time. As you can probably tell from the cover, nature plays a large role in this novel. It's set in part in Montana. It's beautifully written. It's heartwarming and poignant, moving. I've really enjoyed Lucky Turtle. Another of my top 10 novels of 2022 was Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. So another one I read for Big Book Summer. So this is why I enjoy reading bigger books during the summer, because I discover things that I might not have read otherwise. For those of you who think that Stephen King only writes horror, this book is for you. Hearts in Atlantis is a really unique novel. It is actually 2 novellas and 3 short stories, but they're all linked. They all include some of the same characters, and it follows some of these characters from their childhood to old age. It's somewhat historical fiction because it begins in the 1960s, I think. Stephen King is just such a talented writer. No matter what he's writing about, his books are so engrossing, so completely immersive. My husband read this one last summer, and he told me it was one of his favorite Stephen Kings, and I can see why. We have a large Stephen King collection that we inherited from my dad. We both miss him very much, and one of the things we really miss is giving him books and talking to him about books. The cool thing about his Stephen King collection is he wrote in each one when he read it, and if he reread it, this says he reread this one in November 2010. So means a lot to my husband and I. But beyond that, it's just a fabulous novel told in novellas and short stories. Stephen King does add, he can't help himself, he does add a tiny touch of fantasy and sci-fi, but for the most part, this is drama. This is historical fiction, drama, coming of age, that kind of a novel. So very much enjoyed Hearts in Atlantis. Next on the list is a book that my book group chose, so I got it from the library, The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek by Kim Michelle Richardson. This is a book that surprised me. And I was surprised going back over my list of novels read, 45 in total last year, that this one still really stood out to me. My expectations were low. It was chosen for book group, that's why I was reading it. I thought it would be a nice light read. and had so much more depth to it than I expected. It's about a woman who was part of the pack horse librarians during the Depression, in this case in the hill country of Kentucky in Appalachia. It's a wonderful book. It's historical fiction. It's just got a lot of emotional depth to it. I was surprised by how much it pulled me in, how much I came to care for the main character. There's actually a sequel now, which I very much want to read. And this is a book that I enjoyed so much, I got a copy of it for my mom for Christmas. Another novel that I loved so much, I bought a copy for my mom for Christmas, was The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. I love Louise's novels. She's an excellent writer, but I especially love listening to her novels on audio because she reads them herself. And she really has a way of just embodying her characters. And her main character here is someone that you just really love getting to know. As far as I'm concerned, The Sentence is the best of her novels that I've read. I think this was my fourth. It's set in Minnesota from like 2019. Well, the beginning goes back about 30 years, but then most of it is set like around 2019, 2020. Louise herself is actually a character in the novel, and her bookstore is a main part of the novel. Her role as a character is minor, but the bookstore plays a large part in the novel. The main character works in the bookstore. So that's a lot of fun, and definitely, if you like audiobooks, this one is outstanding on audio. Another of my top 10 novels of 2022, which surprised me, was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the first Taylor Jenkins Reid novel I've read. I know everyone else has been raving about her for years. This is the first one I've read. And I wanted to read it because everybody had been talking about it, but this was another novel I didn't expect much from. And the reason it ended up on my top 10 list is because of the way it grabbed me. It's gripping, which I didn't expect. It's written as an oral history of a fictional rock band in the 70s. And when I first saw the sort of interview style it's written in, I wasn't sure I'd get into it. And it was just the opposite. This book just pulled me in from the first pages. The other thing that made it land on my top 10 list is that I couldn't put it down. Every night I stayed up way too late reading it. It's just really engrossing. So I loved Daisy Jones and the Six, and I will definitely read some more of Taylor Jenkins Reid. Coming in right at the end of the year and making the top 10 list was Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I had read The Glass Hotel by Mandel earlier in the year, in the spring. Really enjoyed that. Loved Station 11. But this one I loved most of all because it's a time travel novel. As I mentioned, I love time travel novel. I just find time travel plots incredibly thought-provoking. They just make you think about your own life, about what choices you would make. This one has all the elements I love in time travel. It ranges from 1912 through 2200, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So well into the past and well into the future. It's about the connections between us, and that's a theme I love in novels. So highly recommend Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. Finally, the last book on my top 10 list is The Overstory by Richard Powers. This was another one I read for Big Book Summer. That's a challenge that I host every summer for reading books 400 or more pages. The Overstory probably took me the longest to read this summer of all my big books. because it's a very dense book. It wasn't the longest book I read, but it's very dense, meaning you need to take your time to really digest it. But it's a really stunning book. It is about nature, about trees and how they communicate with each other, but it's also about people and connections between people. And as I said, that's one of my favorite elements of novels. In this case, it begins as the first part is sort of separate short stories about each of the main characters, going back to their childhood. There's usually a tree or trees involved that were an important part of their childhood or their life. And then it moves into the other parts where you see them as adults. They all these disparate threads come together. Another thing I love in a novel. I love a nature setting, and this is all about nature. I just really enjoyed the experience of reading the Overstory, and it makes me want to read other novels by Richard Powers. This was the first one I've ever read. So that's my top 10 fiction from 2022. Adult fiction, actually. I've got separate lists for middle grade and young adult. I loved all of these books, and then there are others on my list of novels read last year that I was really reluctant to leave off the top 10, but it is fun to make a list like this and, look back on what you read and what really made an impression on you. So I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments down below. What were the novels you read last year that really moved you, that were powerful, that have stuck with you, that were in your own personal top 10? Tell me about it in the comments below.